They called her the Spinster of Coldwater Mesa, and they said it the way you'd name a stretch of bad road, a thing to be warned about. But before the town was awake to whisper it, before the first lamp glowed behind the dusty windows of the general merchandise, she was already standing at the corral fence, with the dawn coming up red over the rimrock, her breath silvering in the cold air, watching a green colt decide whether or not to trust her. Her name was Marin Hollis, and the morning belonged to her the way it never quite belonged to anyone else in that town. The sun came over the far blue mesas, slow and gold, and found her there, with her auburn braid pulled forward over one shoulder, her sleeves rolled to the forearm, a coil of rawhide rope easy at her hip. She did not speak to the colt. She had learned long ago that the men who hollered and yanked and broke a horse by main force only ever made a horse that was waiting to break them back. So she stood still, soft in the shoulders, her hazel eyes half lowered, and she let the frightened animal come to its own conclusion about her. And when at last it stretched its trembling neck across the rail and breathed warm and wet against her open palm, she smiled, just a little, just for herself, because there was no one else awake to call it unbecoming in a woman. This was the thing the town could not forgive her. Not that she was unkind, for she wasn't. Not that she was idle, for there was no one in the valley who worked a longer day. They could not forgive her that she ran her dead father's horse yard alone, and ran it better than any man who had ever tried to buy it out from under her. The drovers passing through learned it within a week, that the soundest mounts on the whole high road came out of the Hollis corral, that the woman at the fence could read a lame step before the limp showed, and name your animal's trouble by the set of its ears from 40 feet off. The men respected the horses. They did not know what to do with the woman who'd made them. A capable woman in Coldwater Mesa was a kind of accusation, and the town answered it the only way small towns ever do, with a name. It had been Mrs. Odell who coined it, the shopkeeper's wife, thin and sharp in her bottle green dress with the cameo at her throat and the little feathered hat she wore even to sweep her own porch, had stood in the merchandise doorway one Sunday 2 winters back and watched Marin drive a wagon team down the main street with the reins in her own bare hands, and had said it in a voice pitched to carry, "There goes the Spinster of Coldwater Mesa. Too wild for any decent man, and too proud to mind it. She'll die out there alone with her horses. See if she don't." And because Mrs. Odell said it, and because it was cruel and tidy and easy to repeat, the whole street took it up. The Spinster, as if being unwed at 28 were a sentence already passed. The verdict read, the gavel down. The strange thing, the thing Sally Burke worried over most, kneading bread in the livery kitchen with her soft gray hair tucked under a calico kerchief, was that Marin had stopped flinching when she heard it. There had been a season, early on, when the word could still find the soft place under her ribs and lodge there. Now it slid off her like rain off oiled canvas. She would hear it murmured behind her in the dry goods aisle, and not even turn her head, and Sally thought that was somehow worse than tears. But the truth Marin never said aloud, the truth she kept folded small, where even she didn't look at it often, was that the name still ached, not in front of them, never in front of them. It ached in the evenings, when the work was done and she climbed the porch steps to the house her father had built, and there were the 2 chairs they used to sit in, and one of them empty now and gathering dust, and the whole wide prairie going dark around her, with no voice in it, but her own. She would watch the first stars come out over the water tank and tell herself, the way she told herself 1,000 evenings, that she did not need a man in that other chair, that she had her hands and her horses and her father's good name on her work, and that this was enough. And mostly she believed it. It was only sometimes, when a coyote called far out on the flats and the cold came down off the mesa, and there was no one to say good night to, that the empty chair seemed to take up the whole of the porch, and the name they'd hung on her felt less like a slander than a prophecy. It was into a town that had already made up its mind about everything, most of all about her, that the stranger rode in on a tired sorrel one bright noon at the tail of summer. He came up the long grade from the south, with the dust of 3 counties on his brown leather duster, and the first anyone knew of him was the slow clop of hooves down the main street, and the way the conversation on the merchandise porch dropped off to watch him pass. He was not a big man for the trade he plainly followed, but he sat his horse loose and centered and entirely at home, and there was a coiled stillness to him that made the loungers go quiet without knowing why. Mid-30s, with several days of dark stubble on a strong jaw and short brown hair under a wide brown felt hat, sun-weathered tan, a faded black bandana knotted at his throat, and calm gray eyes that moved over the street once, slow and thorough, the way a man reads a horse he's never worked before. He drew up at the water tank because every path in Coldwater Mesa crossed there, and he let his sorrel drink and asked the boy holding the pump handle a single quiet question. The boy answered it the way the whole town would have. There was a horse, the boy said, a big black stallion, fast as sin and twice as mean, brought up from down on the Pecos by a rancher who'd paid too much for the blood in him and lived to regret it. Cinder, they'd named him, after he'd put 2 men in the dust and near enough killed a third, and now no one in the valley would so much as walk into his pen. The rancher had let it be known he'd pay real money to any man fool enough to gentle the animal, and word of that money had traveled, the way money does, and brought the stranger up the grade. His name was Eli Calhoun, though the town would not learn it for a day or 2 yet, and he had come a long way on the rumor of an unbreakable horse. The town, watching him, settled its expectations into the familiar grooves. A horsebreaker, young enough, well made under the trail dust, unwed by all appearances, and Mrs. Odell, who had appeared at the merchandise door as she always did when there was something to be appraised, was already arranging him in her mind. He would court the Calloway girl, surely. The pretty soft-spoken one the whole street had decided was the acceptable choice. Or, the women murmured, if he proved a charitable sort, he might pity the spinster a little, the way you'd be gentle with a creature that couldn't help its own nature. What none of them imagined was that the stranger might simply ride past their verdict as though it weren't there at all. He stopped at the Hollis yard because he heard her before he saw her. He'd meant to ride straight on to the rancher's place and look at the killer he'd come to break. But as he came level with the split-rail corral at the edge of town, a sound reached him over the fence. Not loud, just low and steady, the particular tone a person uses on a horse and on nothing else in the world. And Eli Calhoun, who had spent his whole life listening for exactly that sound and almost never hearing it done right, pulled up his sorrel without deciding to. He folded his forearms on the top rail and watched. What he saw stopped the half-formed plan dead in his chest. There was a horse in the corral that had clearly come in trouble, a leggy bay gelding strung tight as fence wire, its eyes white-rimmed, sidling and snorting and throwing its head, the kind of frightened animal that took most men an afternoon of fighting to even put a hand on. And there was the woman with the auburn braid and the canvas apron, and she was doing nothing at all. That was the thing that arrested him, that the nothing was the most skillful thing he had seen in years. She had turned herself a quarter away from the horse, her weight settled, her hands loose and low, her eyes off it, and she was simply breathing, slow and visible, letting the bay watch her not want anything from it. He could see her reading the animal the whole time, its near hind, the set of its tail, the place high on its shoulder where the old fear lived, cataloging it all in seconds, the way it took other men a season to learn a single horse. And then, when the gelding's head finally dropped an inch and it let out a long, shuddering breath, she took one unhurried step in, laid her palm flat on its sweating neck, and the fight just went out of the creature like water out of a tipped bucket. Eli Calhoun let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding, and a slow grin broke across his stubbled face, the grin of a craftsman watching another craftsman do the thing he loves done better than he could have done it himself. Most men, seeing a woman best them at their own trade, felt something tighten and sour. Eli felt the exact opposite, the whole long, dusty disappointment of the road lifting off him at once. He had ridden up that grade expecting one more mean horse and one more mean town, and instead he had found, leaning on a fence in the gold noon light, the single most interesting thing he had come across in more years than he cared to count. The woman felt the weight of being watched and turned her head, and her guarded hazel eyes found the stranger at her fence, bracing, the way she always braced, for the smirk or the pity or the comment a man would surely make. But there was no smirk on his face. There was only that astonished, open-hearted grin, and when she met his eyes he didn't look away and didn't tip into mockery. He just said, quiet and plain and meaning every word of it, "Ma'am, I have been breaking horses my whole life, and I don't believe I've ever seen it done cleaner than that." And Maren Hollis, who had armored herself for years against everything a man might say to her, found she had no armor at all for being seen plainly, and liked for exactly the thing they'd taught her to be ashamed of, and the color came up warm in her freckled cheeks before she could stop it, and for the space of one breath, the spinster of Coldwater Mesa did not know what to do with her hands. Garrett Pyle came up the Mesa Road 2 mornings later in his polished black buggy, and the dust that rose behind his wheels seemed to know better than to settle on his charcoal suit. He found Maren at the long water trough, rinsing the dried lather off a buckskin mare's flanks, her sleeves shoved past her elbows, and a streak of corral grime drawn clean across one freckled cheek. He did not dismount at once. He let his small calculating eyes travel the length of her yard, the tight new fence rails, the deep stone tank brimming with spring water that never failed even in the dry months, the open run pushing out toward the best grass for 100 miles, and only when he had finished pricing what was hers did he tip his flat-brimmed hat and call her by her father's name, as if the place were still a man's. He spoke to her the way a patient teacher speaks to a slow child. The town had been generous in its concern for her, he said, and he had come to offer her a kindness no one else would. A woman alone, past the marrying age, with no son and no husband, and a name the whole valley had already buried. What future was there in that but a hard old age and a yard that would slip into ruin? He was prepared to overlook a great deal. He would put his name over her gate and his money behind her debts, and in exchange she need only sign the water rights into his keeping and let him manage the land as a husband ought. He said the word husband softly, like a coin pressed into her palm, and watched her face for the gratitude he was certain would come. Maren did not stop rinsing the mare. She let the water run silver down the buckskin's leg and said, in a voice as level as the trough, that the yard had not slipped in the 3 years since she had buried her father, that the tank had never once run dry under her hand, and that she had read the deed often enough to know exactly what the water beneath her feet was worth to a man like him. Pyle's soft mouth tightened. He climbed back into his buggy with the stiff dignity of a man unaccustomed to being refused by anything he had already decided was beneath him, and as he turned the horse he told her, kindly, regretfully, the way Mrs. Odell told everyone everything, that an offer like his did not come twice to a woman the town had finished with, and that she would do well to remember, the next cold winter, who it was that had reached out a hand. The wheels rolled off down the Mesa Road, and Marin stood a long moment, with her hand pressed flat to the warm stone of the tank her father had built. Feeling the old hardness rise up the back of her throat, the urge to close herself like a gate against a storm. And from the shadow of the corral, where he had been coiling a lead rope and saying nothing, Eli Calhoun straightened, settled his hat, and remarked to no one in particular that he had never in his life seen a man price a woman's water and miss the woman standing in it. It was not much, but it was the truest thing anyone had said to her in 3 years, and something in her chest that had been held shut a long time eased open the width of a breath. After that, the evenings began. Eli took the work of the black stallion as his own, and there was no quick magic in it, only the slow, patient grammar of hands and wait and waiting that Marin understood in her bones. Day after day he stood in the round pen with Cinder, asking nothing, giving the wild dark horse the one thing no one in the valley had ever offered it, the freedom to come close on its own terms. And day after day, Marin leaned on the top rail and watched a man finally do a thing the way she had always done it, without hurry and without fear. They spoke little, and what they spoke was all of horses, which is how people who have been lonely a long time say everything else. He learned that she could read a flinch before it finished crossing a horse's eye. She learned that he had drifted from territory to territory for 15 years, gentling the animals other men had broken, and had stopped more than once in towns with softer girls and kinder names, and had never yet found a reason to unsaddle for good. Sally Burke brought them coffee in dented tin cups as the light went long, and watched the two of them lean on the same rail with the same easy quiet, and smile to herself the way women smile who have waited years to be proven right. On the porch in the blue dusk afterward, her father's empty chair no longer looked quite so empty. For some evenings, Eli sat in it without being asked, and neither of them named the thing that was happening, because to name it was to risk the town's verdict touching it. So they let it grow in the dark, like a thing that did not need a name to be real. The breaking came on a bright, hard morning at the height of the season, when half the valley had come up to Coldwater Mesa for the stock sale, and the dusty main street was thick with wagons and buyers and loud talk. Garrett Pyle was among them, and Pyle had decided, in the way of a man who cannot abide a thing he could not buy, that he would show the gathered town exactly how a real man handled what a spinster and a drifter only fussed over. He had Cinder led out to the corral by the water tank, where everyone could see, and over Marin's sharp warning and Eli's quiet one, he swung up onto the black stallion's bare back, with his spurs flashing and his crowd watching, certain that money and nerve were the same thing as understanding. They are not. The horse came apart beneath him, like a thunderhead breaking. It went up screaming with the whole devil of its old terror in its eyes, flung Pyle into the dust, then wheeled, ears flat, to finish what fear had started, and the crowd that had laughed a heartbeat before went silent with the nearness of a man about to be killed in the street. What happened next, the valley would tell for years, and tell it right. Marin was over the rail before anyone drew breath, her braid flying, her voice dropping into the low, steady tone the horse had learned at dusk, and from the far side Eli came in slow and wide, with his hands open and empty, and the two of them closed on the maddened animal from either side, without ever once getting in each other's way, as though they had broken 100 horses together and would break 100 more. She caught its eye and held it. He laid one open hand flat on its heaving black shoulder. She breathed, and the horse breathed. He shifted his weight, and the horse followed it. And in the space of a minute that felt like an hour, between a freckled woman in a dusty blue dress and a quiet man in a worn brown duster, the killer stallion of Coldwater Mesa lowered its great head, blew out the long, shuddering breath of an animal letting go of its fear, and stood, gentled, in the open street, before the whole staring valley. Garrett Pyle was helped to his feet, white-faced and shaking, and he gathered the rags of his dignity and his buggy and was gone down the Mesa road before the crowd had even finished its astonished murmur, and the town did not call after him. They were looking at her. They were looking at the spinster of Coldwater Mesa, with her hand on the neck of the horse no man could touch. And for the first time in 3 years the valley was seeing her plainly, the way Eli had seen her from the first afternoon. It was Sally Burke who broke the silence. The old cook came forward through the parting crowd with her flour-dusted apron and her kind brown eyes, and she did not lower her voice, for she had carried this truth a long way and meant the whole street to hear it land. She looked at Eli Calhoun, who stood close at Marin's shoulder with that faint half-smile breaking wide across his weathered face, and she said, plain as a church bell, that she had cooked in this valley 40 years and watched good men ride past the best woman in it because they were too small to want a strong thing, and that she had prayed, just once before she died, to see a man with sense enough to know what he was standing beside. Then she folded her arms and waited, and so did the town. For a moment Eli only looked at Marin, at the dust on her cheek and the strength in her hands and the guarded hazel eyes that had stopped flinching at her own name long ago and had never once expected to be chosen. And then, slow and sure, in front of Mrs. Odell in her stiff bottle green dress and her pinched coining mouth, in front of the buyers and the wagons and every soul who had passed the verdict and made it stick, Eli Calhoun raised 2 fingers to the wide brim of his brown felt hat and tipped it to her. He tipped his hat to the woman they had all sworn no man would ever want, and he let his low voice carry just far enough. He said he had drifted 15 years looking for a reason to stay, and found it the first afternoon he watched her ride a frightened horse, and that if she would have a quiet man who knew exactly what he was standing next to, he would not be drifting anymore. The street was so still you could hear the water moving in the stone tank, and Marin Hollis, who had armored herself against this town for 3 hard years, who had let them name her and bury her and write her ending before she had finished living it, felt the last shut gate inside her swing open in the golden light, and she did not harden, and she did not turn away. She smiled. She put her hand in his rough open one in front of them all, and that single gesture undid the verdict more completely than any words could have. Mrs. Odell's pursed mouth opened and found nothing to say, and the name she had coined died right there in the dust of the main street, the way a small mean thing dies when the warmth finally outlasts it. No one in the valley called her the spinster of Coldwater Mesa ever again. By autumn there were 2 chairs filled on the porch at sunset, where there had so long been one and an empty one beside it, and the black stallion grazed gentle and glossy in the run below, and the spring-fed tank her father built ran clear and never failing, and the yard that the town had sworn would slip to ruin under a lonely woman's hand only grew finer, because now there were 2 pairs of capable hands and one shared quiet that neither of them ever bothered to name. And if you are out there tonight, you who have felt a hard verdict settle over your shoulders, you who have been named too much or too strong or too late for the life you wanted, remember the woman on the mesa, and remember that a town's certainty is not the same as the truth, and that sometimes all it takes to undo years of being overlooked is one person with the sense to see you plainly and the courage to tip his hat in front of everyone. You are not finished. Your warmth has not run dry, and the right eyes have a way of finding you in the last gold of the afternoon, just when the valley has decided you never would be found. Thank you for listening today. Wherever you are tonight, I'm grateful you were here by the fire with me. If this story warmed you, stay a while and subscribe to Embers of the Frontier, and keep the home fires burning until I see you again.